The auctioneer's gavel didn't just hit the wooden podium. It echoed through the crowded country club ballroom like a gunshot. My older brother, Julian, leaned over the mahogany table, his breath smelling faintly of expensive scotch and unearned arrogance, and whispered loud enough for the entire front row to hear. "Get your coat, Marcus." The help usually exits through the kitchen. 12 seconds later, my sister, Beatrice, slid a printed PDF across the table. It was a formal eviction, notice for the small, weathered farmhouse where I had spent the last 7 years caring for our dying father while they traveled Europe. "We're leveling the place on Monday," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace without looking me in the eye. "The developers need the footprint for the new golf resort clubhouse. Don't leave anything behind. We already told the crew to throw out Dad's old workbench." They thought they had stripped me of everything. They thought they had engineered the ultimate public exile. The hidden ownership clause that invalidates the entire auction. What they didn't realize was that the very ground they were standing on, the 1,200 acres of Prime Valley land, they had just contracted to sell to an international resort conglomerate for $42 million, didn't belong to our father's estate. The secret 1950s land trust document buried in my father's old workbench. And within exactly 72 hours, the wires they were impatiently waiting for wouldn't just be frozen. They would be legally routed into an account they couldn't touch, leaving them personally liable for a breach of contract lawsuit that would dismantle their lives piece by piece. The impending multi-million-dollar default panic that begins at 9:00 a.m. on Monday. The ballroom was suffocatingly warm, packed with 300 of our hometown's most prominent families, local politicians, and high-net-worth real estate investors. Julian had intentionally structured the reading of our father's will and the subsequent land auction as a single, high-profile gala event. He wanted the community to see the transition of power. He wanted everyone to know that the golden children had returned to claim their kingdom, and that the quiet, dutiful youngest son was being cut loose. When the estate attorney, a family friend named Arthur Vance, who had been bought and paid for by Julian months ago, read the final clause of the will, a heavy silence fell over the room. To my youngest son, Marcus, who chose a life of simple labor, I leave my gratitude, my old oak workbench, and the sum of $0. To my children, Julian and Beatrice, I leave the entirety of the homestead, the corporate entities, and all contiguous real estate holdings. Beatrice didn't even pretend to look somber. She let out a sharp, delicate laugh and raised her glass of champagne toward the mayor's table. Julian clapped Arthur on the back. The room erupted into polite applause and whispered gossip. I could feel every eye in the room burning into the back of my neck. I was wearing my only suit, a charcoal jacket that was slightly frayed at the cuffs from years of pulling double shifts at the local milling plant while managing my father's medical schedule, his dialysis appointments, and his failing memory. "Don't make a scene, Marcus," Julian muttered, his hand gripping my shoulder with a force that was meant to dominate, not comfort. "You played the martyr for 7 years thinking you'd get the crown. But Dad knew who the real businessmen were. You're a caretaker. Go find a house to watch." I looked down at the eviction notice, then up at my brother's immaculate, tailored tuxedo. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even pull away from his grip. I just smiled, very slowly, and folded the eviction notice neatly into my breast pocket. They had no idea that by handing me that piece of paper in front of 300 witnesses, they had just established the exact timestamp I needed to prove malicious intent in federal court. For nearly a decade, the narrative around our family was set in stone. Julian was the brilliant private equity savior in New York. Beatrice was the high society art curator in London. And I was the lazy, uninspired youngest child who stayed behind because I couldn't cut it in the real world. When our father's health collapsed 7 years ago, Julian and Beatrice held a brief, 20-minute conference call. They explained that their schedules were far too critical to be interrupted by hospice logistics. They promised to send monthly stipends to cover the medical bills and my living expenses. Those stipends never arrived. Instead, I spent every dime of my own savings, took out a secondary line of credit on my old pickup truck, and worked 40 hours a week at the mill while spending the other 20 hours checking blood sugar levels, lifting my father in and out of bed, and managing a crumbling property. Julian and Beatrice would fly in once a year, usually around Thanksgiving, take 3 photos for their social media accounts to show how devoted they were, and leave within 48 hours, complaining about the draft in the old house. Whenever I asked them for help with the mounting medical debt, Beatrice would sigh dramatically and say, "Marcus, you live there rent-free. Consider that your compensation. We're busy protecting the family legacy." The town believed them. Everyone thought I was a leech living off my father's past success. When the old man finally passed away 3 weeks ago, Julian didn't even wait for the funeral flowers to wilt before he flew in his legal team to appraise the 1,200 acres of timberland and valley floor. But there was a crucial piece of information my siblings had completely omitted from their calculations because they had never spent more than an hour inside our father's home office. They thought our father was a wealthy real estate developer who owned everything in his own name. They didn't understand how old money in this valley actually worked. 2 years ago, while my father was experiencing a rare night of total mental clarity, he called me into his room. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were sharper than I had seen them in years. He handed me a rusted iron key. "In the bottom drawer of the oak workbench in the barn," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Under the false floor where I keep the old oil rags. Don't open it until they try to sell the land, Marcus. Let them commit to the sale first. Let them sign their names to the line." That night, I went out to the dark barn, unlocked the hidden compartment, and pulled out a leather-bound folio from 1954. It wasn't a copy of a will. It was the original deed of trust established by my grandfather before this town even had a paved main street. My grandfather hadn't left the land to his children. He had placed the entire 1,200 acres into an ironclad, multi-generational agricultural land trust. According to the explicitly written terms of that trust, the land could never be sold, subdivided, or developed unless the trustee was a direct lineal descendant who had maintained continuous primary physical residency on the property for a minimum of 5 consecutive years, immediately preceding the transfer. If the primary resident requirement wasn't met, or if a non-resident tried to liquidate the asset, the entire trust automatically dissolved, and full, unencumbered ownership of the land instantly reverted to the sole resident sibling. Julian hadn't lived in the state for 14 years. Beatrice hadn't spent a full week here since college. For 7 uninterrupted years, I was the only person who met the criteria. My father hadn't left me $0 because he hated me. He had left me $0 because he knew the moment he died, the land trust would bypass his will entirely. He left me nothing in the estate because I already owned the dirt beneath his feet. I left the country club ballroom without saying another word. As I walked out into the cool evening air, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated alert from the county clerk's registry database. Julian had just digitally uploaded the preliminary sales agreement with the resort developers to secure their $4.2 million non-refundable earnest money deposit. The clock was officially ticking. They had exactly 48 hours before the deed transfer was scheduled to go before the county zoning board for final approval. On Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after the auction, the escalation began. I didn't call Julian. I didn't call Beatrice. Instead, I drove down to the local hardware store, purchased 4 heavy-duty industrial chains and master locks, and drove back to the property. At 7:00 a.m., a massive flatbed truck carrying an oversized excavator rattled down the gravel driveway. It was the advance crew for the development company, hired by Julian to begin clearing the perimeter trees near my farmhouse to show immediate progress to their overseas investors. I parked my old Ford truck directly across the narrow bridge that served as the sole entry point to the property. I stepped out, holding a thermos of coffee and a laminated copy of the 1954 trust agreement. The foreman, a burly man named Vance with a clipboard, climbed out of his truck, looking annoyed. "Hey, buddy, you need to move the rig. We've got orders from Julian Vance to begin clearing the South Ridge today. Julian doesn't have the authority to authorize heavy machinery on this property," I said calmly, taking a sip of coffee. "This is private property, and you're currently attempting to trespass with commercial equipment." Vance laughed, pulling out his phone. "Look, kid, I don't know what kind of family drama you've got going on, but Julian signed the developer contract yesterday. He showed us the probate papers. He owns the place." "Call him," I said. "Tell him Marcus is at the bridge, and tell him to bring his corporate attorney." 20 minutes later, Julian's silver Mercedes SUV tore down the driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. He slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. He was still wearing his expensive loafers from the night before, now getting coated in Gray Valley dust. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Julian shouted, marching up to my truck, his face bright red. "I gave you until Monday to clear your trash out of the house. You're delaying a $40 million closing. Do you have any idea what the daily liquidated damages are on a contract of this size? If we miss the Monday afternoon zoning filing, the buyers can walk. Then I suggest you tell the nice man with the excavator to turn his engine off," I replied, my voice completely level. "Because every minute that machine idles on this bridge is costing you money you don't actually have." Julian pulled out a thick packet of legal documents from his leather briefcase and shoved them toward my chest. "This is the probated will, you arrogant little leech. It was stamped by the county court yesterday afternoon. Dad left everything to Beatrice and me. You have zero legal standing. Move the truck before I have the sheriff haul you away in cuffs." I didn't take his documents. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, high-resolution color photocopy of the 1954 grandfather trust deed, complete with the original county ledger stamps from 7 decades ago. "This is a certified copy of the Vance Family Trust, Chapter 4, Section 12, I said, reading directly from the page. "It states that any attempt to encumber, sell, or commercialize the valley acreage by a non-resident heir results in an immediate, automatic, and unappealable forfeiture of all estate claims regarding the real property." It was filed 50 years before Dad wrote his will. A will cannot distribute an asset that is already owned by a pre-existing, restrictive trust. Julian snatched the paper from my hand. I watched his eyes scan the text. At first, his expression was pure contempt. Then, as he reached the section detailing the 5-year continuous residency requirement, the color began to drain from his face. His lips thinned into a pale line. This is ancient history," he stammered, his voice dropping an octave. "This was superseded by Dad's corporate filings in the 90s. Our lawyers checked the title. Your lawyers checked the corporate title, Julian. They didn't check the historical land patent registry because you told them it was a straightforward inheritance," I said. "Dad never moved the land out of the trust because he couldn't. The trust is irrevocable. And guess who has utility bills, tax filings, and medical registry records proving continuous physical residency right here for the last 2,555 days?" Julian looked from the paper to the foreman, who was now watching the exchange with intense curiosity. Julian's hand began to tremble slightly. He knew that if the development company's legal team got even a hint of a title defect before Monday morning, they wouldn't just delay the closing. They would trigger the fraud clause in the earnest money contract, demanding their $4.2 million back immediately, plus punitive damages. And Julian had already spent $1.5 million of that deposit that morning to clear his personal trading debts in New York. By Sunday afternoon, the cracks in Julian and Beatrice's perfect facade were widening into a canyon. They had spent the last 24 hours desperately trying to find a loophole, calling every high-priced real estate attorney from here to the capital. But the law was absolute. Old agricultural trusts designed to protect family land from out-of-state developers were ironclad in our district. To make matters worse, the news had leaked. I hadn't told anyone, but Vance, the construction foreman, had a brother who sat on the county zoning board. By Sunday evening, the rumors were flying through the town's social circles like wildfire. The very people who had looked down their noses at me at the country club gala were suddenly changing their tunes. I was sitting on the front porch of the farmhouse at 6:00 p.m. when a car pulled up. It was Arthur Vance, the estate attorney who had looked so smug while reading the will 48 hours prior. He didn't look smug now. He looked terrified. He climbed out of his luxury sedan, holding a fresh bottle of high-end bourbon as a peace offering. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice dripping with forced camaraderie as he walked up the porch steps. "We need to talk. There's been a massive misunderstanding regarding your father's estate. Julian and Beatrice were misinformed about the nature of the property's structure. I'm sure we can settle this out of court. We can set up a secondary distribution. Say $2 million, cash. You don't even have to move out of the house." "$2 million?" I asked, leaning back in my wicker chair. "That's generous, Arthur. Considering you sat there on Friday night and watched my sister hand me an eviction notice while you chuckled." "I was just executing the paperwork presented to me by the executors," Arthur said, quickly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I didn't have the historical context. If you file an injunction tomorrow morning before the zoning meeting, it ruins everyone. The town loses the resort investment. The bank will pull Julian's corporate lines of credit. It'll be a disaster for the family name." "You mean it'll be a disaster for Julian's bank account?" I replied. "And as for the family name, my name is Marcus Vance. I live here. My name stays on the land. Their names are the ones getting erased." Before Arthur could respond, another car pulled up the driveway, then another. It was the mayor's chief of staff, followed by two prominent local business owners who had invested heavily in Julian's secondary syndication fund. They weren't there to support Julian. They were there to see if the rumors were true. They wanted to know if the quiet brother who they had ignored for 7 years was about to bankrupt the golden boy. Monday morning arrived with the cold, crisp clarity of an autumn dawn. The county zoning board meeting was scheduled for precisely 10:00 a.m. in the municipal auditorium. This was supposed to be Julian and Beatrice's victory lap, the moment the public land use permits were officially transferred to the International Resort Group. When I walked into the auditorium at 9:45 a.m., the atmosphere was electric. The front 3 rows were completely occupied by the development company's executives, their out-of-town lawyers in sharp pinstripe suits, and a dozen local reporters. Julian and Beatrice were sitting at the main petitioner's table. Beatrice looked like she hadn't slept a wink. Her makeup was heavy, trying to mask the dark circles under her eyes. Julian was frantically typing on his laptop, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a harsh whisper as he argued with someone on the other end of the line. When I entered, the entire room went completely quiet. I wasn't wearing my frayed suit today. I was wearing my clean, dark canvas work jacket and jeans. I walked right down the center aisle and took a seat directly behind the developer's legal team. Julian slammed his phone down, turned around, and glared at me. He stood up and marched over, leaning over my row. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can block this? Our legal team has been up all night. A 1954 trust can be challenged if there's evidence of economic obsolescence. The land isn't being used for agriculture anymore." "You're bluffing, Marcus." "I'm not blocking anything, Julian," I said, setting a heavy manila folder on the empty seat next to me. "I'm just here to watch the show." "But before the board calls the meeting to order." You might want to look at the certified mail receipt that was just delivered to your lead buyer's headquarters in Miami 10 minutes ago. Julian froze. What did you send them? The full title abstract, I said softly, along with a filed lease pendens from the state circuit court. In exactly 4 minutes, their lead counsel is going to call that phone in your hand, and they aren't going to be asking for an extension. They're going to be exercising their termination clause. Right on cue, at exactly 9:58 a.m., the cell phone in Julian's hand began to vibrate violently. The caller ID displayed a Miami area code. Julian's face went from pale to completely translucent. He answered it with a trembling voice. Hello, yes, this is Julian. No, wait, that's a historical anomaly. We have a correction suite ready to file. Sir, if you just give us 24 hours. He didn't get 24 hours. The voice on the other end was loud enough for me to hear the sharp, metallic tone of a corporate lawyer delivering a fatal blow. The call lasted less than 30 seconds before the line went dead. At 10:00 a.m., the chairman of the zoning board struck his gavel. Item number 1 on the agenda, the Vance Valley Resort zoning variance and title transfer. The lead attorney for the development conglomerate stood up. He didn't walk to the podium. He just gathered his leather folders, packed them neatly into his briefcase, and turned to the board. Mr. Chairman, due to newly discovered, unresolvable defects in the title and ownership structure of the subject property, my client wishes to formally withdraw our petition with prejudice. Furthermore, we are initiating immediate legal proceedings to recover all advanced capital from the listed executors. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Local investors began shouting across the rows at Julian, demanding answers about their syndication money. Beatrice buried her face in her hands, weeping openly as she realized her London townhouse allowance had just evaporated into thin air. Julian stood frozen at the table, staring at the empty podium as his entire financial empire collapsed into dust around him. He owed the buyers $4.2 million that he had already partially spent. His credit lines were ruined, and he no longer had an estate to sell to save himself. 2 hours later, the chaos had cleared out of the municipal auditorium, leaving only the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. I walked out to the parking lot where my old Ford truck was parked. Julian was leaning against his Mercedes, his tie loosened, looking like a ghost of the man who had told me to exit through the kitchen 3 days ago. Beatrice was already gone, having caught an emergency Uber to the nearest airport. As I unlocked my truck door, Julian looked up. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was completely broken. Why did you do it this way, Marcus? You could have come to us weeks ago. You could have told us about the trust before we signed the contract. Why let us get this far just to destroy us? I paused, my hand on the truck handle. I looked at my brother, the man who had left me to handle our father's agonizing final years alone, the man who had tried to throw my father's life's work into a dumpster to build a golf course. The man who thought status was something you bought rather than something you earned. If I told you before you signed, Julian, you would have spent 2 years trying to fight it with expensive lawyers while Dad's property rotted, I said calmly. I needed you to put your names on that contract. I needed you to prove to the entire world exactly what you were willing to sell out for. I climbed into the driver's seat and rolled down the window. Julian stood there, realizing that he was completely at my mercy for the inevitable liquidation lawsuits that would follow. Enjoy New York, Julian, I said as I started the engine. But when you leave this valley today, make sure you take the highway, because you don't have permission to use my bridge anymore.